Hey everyone, I'm Mary Poppins, y'all! In this video, I'm going to be ranking all 29 MCU movies with the release of Thor: Love and Thunder. Over the past 3 weeks, me and my wife-to-be went on a massive rewatch to properly prepare.
Nothing goes over my head. My reflexes are too fast.
I'm a huge fan of the MCU. Over the years, they've been some of the only movies I've actually gone to the theater to see consistently.
I know, it's great, right?
Another!
And there isn't really a bad film on this list as they're all pretty solid. Some are just a little better than others. Lumi and I are both working on some other Marvel projects, including ranking all post-credit scenes, Stan Lee cameos, and villains.
I can do this all day.
Yeah, I know.
So if you don't want to miss out on those, please like and subscribe. It means a ton. And please let me know what you think down below. I'd love to have some good conversations about these movies, but let's not waste any more time and jump into this. Yes! In last place for me is Eternals. Even though this one is in last place, I don't think it's all bad by any means. It has a really unique feel and the cinematography is outstanding. On second rewatch, the story makes a lot more sense and there's a ton of little details thrown in. But the story does feel rushed and I think more setup was needed or this should have been made into a TV show. For me, it relies way too much on flashbacks. The backstory on how the Eternals have been around forever, influencing and watching Earth was cool, but it raised way too many questions for me. And the movie failed to answer all of them in a satisfying way. The main cast of Eternals are a mixed bag for me as well. I really liked Gilgamesh and Phastos, but for the most part, I really couldn't connect with any of them and they fell flat. They just didn't have a ton of personality or emotion. The CGI and the deviance is kinda weak, especially compared to how great the backdrops look. And I think the world building is interesting, and I really can't wait to see where it goes. I just feel like they jammed way too much in too soon, and they ended up making kind of a beautiful mess. So I have to put this one in last place, but I could see it changing in the future depending on what they do from here. In 28th for me is the first Thor. I really like the fish out of water aspect this movie has with Thor coming to Earth powerless, and it leads to a good arc with him finding his inner worthiness to retrieve his hammer. However, as fun as these aspects are, the tone shift in the beginning going from Asgard to New Mexico is a little jarring. I wanted to stay in this magical new place, and I prefer Thor when he has his powers as well. We get to see a decent amount of action in an early fight with the Frost Giants, who look really cool by the way, but that's pretty much all the action in this movie. Even the final fight is really anticlimactic. But Loki is a blast as always, and I like his storyline here setting up his quest for power in all the later movies. Coulson gets a ton of screen time in this movie, and you gotta love that. He's one of the best side characters in the whole MCU. There's some fun world building in this one with S.H.I.E.L.D. and early Asgard. So overall, there's nothing really wrong with this movie. I'm just not a big fan of all the decisions that they made, and I think they were still trying to figure out the best tone for Thor as a character. I wanted a little more fun and emotion, especially this being a Thor and Marvel movie. Next up for me, I have Captain Marvel. This MCU edition has a lot of fun with its 80s setting, and there's a lot of things inside this movie that I really like. Nick Fury gets a good amount of screen time, and I like what he brings here as always. The storyline with Talos finding his family is amazing. There's some nice emotion and themes with them being war refugees. And I like the twist with him being a good guy. The movie's tone lends itself well to the story and characters, and there's some nice humor thrown in to balance things out. Unfortunately, I'm not a huge fan of Captain Marvel as a character. She's just not that relatable to me. Her backstory and personality aren't that interesting. Nobody is a real threat to her, and that makes for no tension in any of the action. Although it is filmed really well and has an epic feel to it. There's some really good side characters in this movie, and they for sure steal the show from her. There's some funny jokes thrown in, and I personally love that Fury lost his eye to a space kitty. This one is pretty solid, just kind of meh for me compared to some of the other films on this list. Up next on my list, I have Thor 2: The Dark World. This movie builds off the first Avengers film really nicely. I like how compared to the first Thor, we get a lot more of Thor being a badass in this one. It starts with a bang, and the end battle is a ton of fun. There's epicness and weight within all the action. I think they also in this film started to figure Thor out as a character a little more. He's a lot more likable compared to the first film. There's also a fair amount of emotion here with Thor's mom's death along with Loki's fake death, which I actually kind of forgot about. Even though we all know he's alive, I think it still packs a punch. And a lot of people forget about the end credits scene in this movie. It's really underrated with the first appearance of the Collector and a really funny gag at the end. A big negative for me though is the villain Dark Elf Markeith was really weak and unmemorable. I'm not even sure how to say his name. I do like the twist with Loki being part elf though. I kind of forgot about that as well. There's some really good moments in this film. All in all, this movie gets a lot of hate, but it's not all deserved in my opinion. It's far from top tier Marvel, but it's solid enough. Up next for me is Iron Man 3. This is a very interesting film as it has some high highs and some really low lows. It features one of my favorite Iron Man set pieces with everyone falling in the sky and him saving them one by one. And it was pretty cool seeing Tony kick some ass spying around without his suit for a change. Tony's dynamic with the young kid in the second and third act a little bit was really great. They have some nice quiet moments together. The twist villain's motivations are really generic and there's nothing memorable about him. And I feel like they wasted a really great actor and pissed off a lot of hardcore comic book fans in the process. I can also really never get into the powers they have in this film. They just kind of shoot red stuff and it's never really explained that well. The Mandalorian twist is not horrible and the actor they get is pretty entertaining, though over the top. And unfortunately this movie is kind of skippable in the grand scale of the MCU. Other than Tony's arc building up to Ultron, they didn't really go for any big expanding storylines. I think the action holds up really well though, especially the end with all the different Iron Man suits showing up. The director Shane Black did a pretty good job directing this one with the dialogue that's really sharp and witty. It's just not my favorite. On to my next pick, I have The Incredible Hulk. I'm not sure why this movie gets all the disrespect it does. I've always liked this film and I think it holds up pretty well even today. I love the different action set pieces they throw the Hulk in. This is probably the most badass version of the Hulk we get. You can really feel the destruction and impact in the action. Edward Norton does an okay job in the role of Bruce Banner, but Mark Ruffalo is for sure the better casting choice. The villain in this one is really good and I really like what it builds up to in the final act with their fight. Though the CGI might be a little bit dated, but I feel like you can't hate on it a whole lot. It was 2008. I think the story offered up is solid with Bruce trying to cure himself. However, this movie compared to the others lacks the world building for sure, except for the very end. Even though the tone can be a little messy at times, as I don't think the jokes they try to throw in work extremely well, this is a solid, well-made movie, and I wish it got a little more acknowledgement within the MCU and wasn't such a black sheep. Moving on is Ant-Man and the Wasp. This movie is great, and I love how compared to the first, we get a lot more fun sequences with Ant-Man, and they even include his girlfriend, the Wasp. The action is really amped up, and they take advantage of the gimmick well. The car chase sequence is absolute gold, and I really enjoy the multiple villains featured. Walter Goggins is a blast, though not really that imposing in the film. Ghost had a tragic backstory, and I was really sympathetic towards her. And the overall story was really solid trying to find Hank Pym's wife and Hope's mom. The emotional stakes were great, though relatively small compared to the larger universe. Sadly, a lot of the unique feel and fun dialogue from the first seems to be absent here. It isn't quite as sharp and the humor takes a back seat, though still a prominent feature. The Truth Serum running gag is superb and always cracks me up. This movie just feels a little mad compared to the others above it. It's still really enjoyable though and a solid addition to the MCU. Next up for me I have Black Panther. My favorite aspects of this movie are by far the villain Killmonger and how sympathetic his backstory is, as well as the debate on how Wakanda should operate in the modern world. It's really relatable given the times we're in. I think this movie does a great job introducing Wakanda into the MCU without feeling forced. The side characters in this movie are excellent as well and really memorable. I love T'Challa's sister Shuri. She's probably my favorite newbie introduced, along with the minor love interest Nakia. Claw also gets a lot of screen time, and you gotta love that. The storyline is really good, and I love the redemptive arc T'Challa goes on, but I don't think he's that interesting of a character. He's portrayed really well, but he lacks the charismatic screen presence and is kind of flat to me. He's probably like my 6th favorite character in the whole movie, and that's not really a good thing. The action and CGI in this film also feel really iffy at times, especially the final fight between Killmonger and Black Panther. It makes it hard to really get into it. But it's still a great addition to the MCU, and I love the story and villain. I just have trouble connecting to the main character. Next up on my list, I have Spider-Man 2: Far From Home. I've seen this movie several times, and every time I watch it, I try so hard to buy what's happening plot-wise, but I just can't. The idea of Tony giving Peter the glasses so soon is ridiculous. Why not Pepper Potts? And Mysterio's plan doesn't make sense at all long-term. Attaching holograms to drones is a little ridiculous. If one Avenger shows up, he's screwed. It's just a little bit too much for me. I do love Jake Gyllenhaal, and the performance he gives, though, he almost sells it and makes it work. The humor can be really great at times, but it can also be really hit and miss. The camera falling into the water joke is so stupid, and I want to fast forward through it every time. I do really like MJ and Peter's growing relationship in this film, and I think it's really well done compared to the first. The action is really good, but it's not that engaging watching Spider-Man's fight drones personally. It lacks any grittiness or weight to the punches. But the final battle is a lot of fun with Ned, Flash, MJ, and Happy joining in on the action, along with Nick Fury. The elementals are really cool. I just kind of wish they weren't fake at the end of the day. I love the themes within, with Peter taking over for Tony, and it really hit me hard emotionally. I think this movie connects to the larger universe really well as well. But the larger world stakes aren't really present here because it's all fake. I do really enjoy this one though, and it has one of the best post-credit scenes with the identity reveal teaser along with the twist of Nick Fury being off-planet the whole time. Next on the list is the first Iron Man. I know this is probably a lot higher on a lot of people's list, and there's no hate from me being directed towards it. It just doesn't resonate with me as well as some of the other films on this list, and I don't have a ton of nostalgia for it. And as much as I love Iron Man, he's not my favorite hero in the MCU. And Tony can be kind of unlikable early on, but his charisma really makes it work, along with the satisfying arc he goes through. Going from arms dealer to peacekeeper works so well for his backstory, and they nailed it. It's definitely one of the slower films in the MCU, but it works so well. And this movie has to get some major cred for setting the early tone for the MCU continuing forward. The villain is great, though a little bit cliche. It makes sense here and isn't forced. I'd be pissed too if I was that guy. They just needed a few more scenes fleshing him out. The action in this movie isn't that great, and it's for sure among the weakest on this list, along with the pacing and humor. But it does by far have one of the tightest plots, and it nails what it's trying to do, and you can't hate on the rock music thrown in. I just can't personally justify putting it any higher with everything else the MCU has to offer. Next up is Black Widow. I love the dark themes that this movie has in it and wish they would have been more prevalent in the film. The grittiness of the opening credits had me excited, but it kind of lost it as the film went on. But I did really enjoy the movie. I just wish we would have gotten more of Black Widow's backstory. Usually I dislike prequels, but I was down this time. Her character has such mystery and intrigue, and I was curious how she got here. It was a joy seeing David Harbour in the film as the Red Guardian, and I wanted more action-wise. He's probably my favorite part of the whole movie. He has some of the funniest moments. Black Widow's sister Yelena was great, and I hope we see more of her in the future MCU. And according to the after credits, we will. She has some hilarious and badass scenes.
This thing that you do when you whip your hair when you're fighting.
Fighting pose. You're a total poser.
I'm not a poser.
Ugh, that was disgusting.
It's great how this movie has like 5 twists towards the end, with the mom being evil but not, and the pheromones. It's almost too much, but I think they kind of make it work. I thought the design and setting of the Red Room was really cool and an interesting setting. The typical MCU humor is scattered throughout the film, but it's much less prevalent than a lot of the other movies. But I think it fits the tone and balances out really well. The villain is okay, but not really that memorable, though he does pose an interesting threat. This movie is really solid, but it just doesn't have the overall impact on the MCU or the major connections almost all the other films have, nor the huge emotional response I thought it would have following her departure from the MCU. Up next is Iron Man 2. This movie is kind of sloppy story-wise, and it has way too many plot lines going on, but I find them all engaging enough to stay thoroughly entertained, and enough of them pay off to make it worth it. There's some interesting personal stakes with Tony's shrapnel entering his heart. It adds some great urgency in my opinion. This is probably the most unlikable version of Tony Stark, but it totally makes sense because he thinks he's dying. The dual villains in this film are pretty solid, though neither are MCU greats, but they personally entertain me. Whiplash is given just enough backstory and has some cool sequences. I really like the racetrack fight with Tony. The team up with Justin Hammer, played by the amazing Sam Rockwell, is stupid but works because of his desperation and ineptitude. I think the recast of Rhodes in this film was well done, and I like the acknowledgement that they have within. Don Cheadle definitely grows on you fast. Black Widow gets her first MCU appearance here working undercover for Nick Fury, adding in a cool S.H.I.E.L.D. backdrop to everything. All in all, I totally acknowledge that this film has some flaws, but I think the story it tells is solid enough, and I stay engaged throughout. Next is Captain America: The First Avenger. My favorite part of this film by far is the first act's underdog vibe. I find it really easy to get into, and I love Steve Rogers before he gets his powers. He's so likable and pure at heart without being over the top annoying. Though the CGI on him can be a little bit distracting early on. Him and Bucky's friendship is wonderful and I totally buy it, but I feel like they really mishandled Bucky's fake out death. It loses all impact on rewatch and it's a tad ridiculous, and sets up a cliche Marvel trope with nobody staying dead. Thankfully, they fix this cliche later on though. I also think him and Peggy Carter's relationship is set up well for the payoff in Endgame. The villain isn't amazing, but I really love Hugo Weaving and love the performance he gives. It has a surprising amount of world building, giving us an early look at an Infinity Stone and giving us a glimpse at the power of the Stark name in the whole universe. The action isn't amazing, but it's solid enough and there's some good sequences. My big negatives for this one are I think the second act montage is a little bit dull, and I think the way they handled Cap getting frozen was really dumb. There's plot holes for days there. Like, why didn't they look for him, or why didn't he just jump out before he landed? He's kind of a superhero, you know. But this film ended with one of the best after credit scenes with Cap waking up in the future. It sets things up so well. Moving on to my next pick, Doctor Strange. The central premise of this movie is really fascinating to me. The world's greatest surgeon being helpless to heal himself was great, and I really feel for him. My favorite set piece in this film by far is the first fight between Strange and Mad Mikkelsen's character, with the Cape's introduction swooping in and assisting. I think the humor is really well done in this one, and blends with the overall tone well. Though there's some cringe here and there for sure. All the different side characters introduced here are really good. Wong is an absolute standout and keeps popping up in other films for different reasons. For a reason. I think the action and visuals really stand out among the MCU, and this movie sets up some crazy interesting world building that some of the most recent movies are dabbling with. My biggest issues with this one is probably the second act. The training sequences lack a dynamic feel, and you can never really track his progression. He goes from noob to super powerful a little too fast for me. And the big bad villain is cool, but isn't really set up that well. They just keep name dropping him throughout. Show, don't tell, please. At least a little bit.
Ants! Ant-Man!
Coming up next for me is Ant-Man. This small contained film has an unbelievable cast that all mesh so well together. The dialogue is super sharp, and I love the heist aspects scattered throughout. Luis and his flashback stories are hilarious, and I want more. He could pop up in every movie for like 30 seconds and I would love it. Scott Lang's redemptive story arc is really satisfying, and I love the relationship he has with his daughter. It's super sweet. I really like what they did with the shrinking gimmick. They took full advantage, and the ant action was amazing. The final fight scene is really entertaining, and the villain, Hank Pym's old student, was pretty solid. His motives made sense and was a good foe for Ant-Man, but he's very cliche, and you could easily mix him up with any number of scorned exes that become evil. In my opinion, this is one of the most unique, lighthearted, and comedic Marvel movies. There's just nothing about it that's super amazing, and it's easily skippable in the grand MCU universe, but I really enjoy it even after multiple viewings. Up next is Doctor Strange 2. One of the newest, coolest, and most interesting movies in my books for sure, with some really nice mature adult themes they throw in. The story has some interesting complex layers, and I think they did a good job keeping the audience on their toes with the multiverse without getting too confusing. It was tragic to see Wanda's arc come to a close as she can't cope with the loss anymore. They set it up really well throughout the previous movies, but for me it lacked the emotional impact it should have given the stakes. But I think there's so many amazing things inside this film, and it sets up so many interesting possibilities. It was just a tad disappointing they didn't completely swing for the fences as great as it was. I love the cameos thrown in everywhere, and I hope they fulfill some of the things they previewed, like the Fantastic Four and even the X-Men. Evil Peggy Carter was amazing to see in Cap's role as well. I think Rachel McAdams' character was much better utilized compared to the first film. She wasn't such an afterthought. The action is fantastic, and they really upped their game on the sorceries. And Zombie Strange was awesome with his Cape of Souls at the very end. Overall, this movie is a ton of fun. I just wish they swung for the fences a little bit more. It's lacking levity within all the serious drama, so I have to put it a little bit lower. Up next is a surprise hit for me, Shang-Chi. This movie has some of the coolest visuals of all the films on this list. I especially enjoyed the first 35 minutes of the movie. It had an energetic Kingsman feel, from the music to the character dynamic between Shang-Chi and his best friend Katie, played by Awkwafina, who steals the show in my opinion. This is by far not the most humorous film, but the jokes they go for land thanks mostly to Shang-Chi's previously mentioned friend. But unfortunately, it shifted in tone dramatically once we got into the flashbacks and backstory. Though done well, it was disappointing to see the energy go from the film. But it does pick up towards the end with some great creatures and a fun battle featuring a cool-ass water dragon. I didn't find the villain, Shang-Chi's dad, to be very engaging and would mark him among the weakest of the MCU big bads. He did accidentally summon a freaky soul-sucking monster though, and that was really great. The sister character was kind of weak for me, but they were setting her up as an evil character though, so it makes sense that I wasn't really rooting for her. And I do like the after credits setting things up for the future. I think the action is filmed excellently. It's filmed with these great wide shots, and the choreography is among the best in the MCU. My favorite set piece by far is the bus fight scene. It's done so well and is super funny. I think this movie is super fun, and I really enjoyed it. I just wasn't fully invested emotionally, and I felt like the second act dragged just a little bit. Coming up next for me is Avengers 2: Age of Ultron. This was one of the hardest movies to place on this list, as I love so many things about it, but what holds it back for me is the unbalanced tone, and it feels a little bit bloated for me. They undercut the action and drama with some ill-timed humor on a few too many occasions, but for the most part, I think it really works. This is one of the quippiest movies for sure, but it also features one of my favorite scenes with everyone trying to pick up Thor's hammer. I like seeing everyone happy and having a good time for a change. The villain Ultron gets a lot of hate, but I personally really like him. He just needed a little bit more setup, but I think his motivations are really relevant and work well as times go on and we experiment with AI technology ourselves. This movie does a really good job at setting up and teasing like 6 future movies, from Wakanda to Ragnarok and Tony and Cap's feud in Civil War. I think Quicksilver and Scarlet Witch bring a fun dynamic here, and I was bummed to see Silver go so soon. I think if this movie would have slowed down a little, similar to Eternals, it would have helped out a lot. But I still really enjoy it, especially as a rewatch, knowing everything we know now. There's so many satisfying moments inside this film. Coming in next on my list is Spider-Man No Way Home. Similar to the second Spider-Man movie, I feel like this had some incredible highs, but also some real lows. But let's start with the positives. As a big Spider-Man fan and having seen all the previous movies, I got a ton out of this film. It's dripping with member berries, and I personally love all the cameos and callbacks and find them super satisfying. I love seeing all the big bads and different Spider-Mans show up, and I think it led to an awesome third act with an epic, emotional, and funny end. It was so much fun seeing Ned show off his sorcerer skills, and I like how Doctor Strange steps into that mentor role a little bit for Peter. My favorite scene is probably the 3 Peters talking about their own experiences on the roof, but I could totally see a lot of people not enjoying this one as it relies too heavily on nostalgia. So much so, I think they undercut the most emotional scene in the movie with Aunt May's death. I thought it was done pretty well, but it could have been great. I don't think they needed the great power comes great responsibility line. And it also has a pretty weak story in comparison to the top movies on this list. There's just a few too many plot holes and bad decisions made throughout. Up next for me is Captain America: The Winter Soldier. This movie's spy thriller theme is amazing, and I think they absolutely nailed it. It's great seeing Goody Two-Shoes Cap navigate the corrupt government landscape of the modern world. There's some amazing boots on the ground action with Cap, Falcon, and Black Widow, and so many badass scenes. This is one of the best directed films in terms of action scenes on this list. The elevator sequence with Cap is probably my favorite. In my opinion, they did a great job establishing the connection between Falcon and Cap. Their friendship arc ends in a super satisfying way, and the scene where Cap visits old Peggy is so sad. They nailed it, in my opinion. It's really interesting the way this movie impacts the MCU, with S.H.I.E.L.D. being secretly run by Hydra for years, though it's not set up at all in any of the previous films. I'm not a huge fan of the way they brought Bucky back. It works emotionally, but I just don't really understand how he's alive. Just a small nitpick for me. But other than that, I think this film is great. The story and tension is all top notch. Coming in next is the first Avengers, the first epic team-up movie the MCU made, and it is an absolute treat. There's so many amazing things in this movie, and it's no knock being where it is. It has the great emotional scenes with Coulson's death. I hate Cap's costume in this one, but I'll give it a pass because Coulson designed it. It has one of the funniest and most satisfying moments when Loki gets Hulk smashed, and I think they did a good job working Hulk into the film naturally. The story with Loki invading Earth is pretty solid, and he makes a wonderful villain, and it's really interesting how it all connects to Thanos at the end. They balanced the whole cast really well, as all the Avengers films do. The reasons it's not higher up on my list is because the first act can drag just a little bit, but I think that's only because the end is so amazing and you're just waiting for it. I don't think the Chitauri that the Avengers are fighting at the end are super interesting. It would have been cool to have a dash more variety or like a mini boss. But anytime all the characters we love are together, I don't know how you can't enjoy it at least a little bit. I would have enjoyed it a little bit more though if they weren't arguing through the first 2/3 of the film. Let me know whether this one should be higher or lower down below. I'm really curious what everyone thinks. My next pick is Thor: Love and Thunder. The most recent entry in the MCU did not disappoint me at all. It was a little sad to see the Guardians go so soon in the movie, but that was no big surprise to me. I think this movie did an excellent job balancing the humor with the intense drama, and I was really well impressed with how well the light and dark themes work together. My favorite thing about this movie by far is the villain played by Christian Bale. He did an amazing job. It was like the Joker and Voldemort had a baby. He was creepy and kind of funny, along with having a interesting backstory. I love that Korg gets a bigger role, and the gag with his face and the future baby is hilarious. I absolutely hate Zeus in this film, but I like what they set up for future movies. Jane felt a little bit forced in, but I think they did an okay job making it work, and it was sad the way she went out. I feel so bad for Thor, but at least he has a kid now. I like the running gag of Thor's relationship with his hammer. Overall, I think this one holds up to the level of comedy and epicness of Thor Ragnarok. The scene with Thor giving the kid some juice was absolutely amazing. And this one has some great action as always, and the final battle is breathtaking. Overall, I love this film. Check out my full review on my channel if you want to know more. Up next on my list is the first Spider-Man movie. Probably my favorite part about this movie is Peter Parker / Spider-Man. This has to go up there as one of the best castings they have pulled off. This is by far one of the funniest movies in the MCU in my opinion. I think the action is really well done as well. The set piece at the Washington Monument was absolutely gut-wrenching. I'm not scared of heights personally, but I could really feel how high up he was. And the sequence on the boat was great as well. There are so many memorable scenes in this movie. I love Ned in this movie. He brings a great innocence as the guy in the chair. And I think Iron Man was also used absolutely perfectly. I loved what he brought to the film. This movie is very small scale, but it balances well with the larger world, building off of Civil War and setting the dynamics up for Endgame. And there are also some really great emotional moments for me, from Tony taking Peter's suit to him finding his inner strength to stop Vulture, who is a really memorable villain within the Marvel catalog. He's small stakes, but they build him up really well with his character motivations. He poses a great threat for Spider-Man, and the twist reveal of his larger identity I thought was excellent. The final battle is really engaging, and you can feel the weight of the action. And I thought the setting in the high school was really great and gave the movie a unique feel in the Marvel Universe. And I really like it for the most part. But I think the tone and humor can be hit and miss at times, but it makes sense within the movie because the characters are so young. I'm mixed on the advanced suit in this movie. It works well, but it feels like a little bit too much too soon. My big negatives for this one is I don't think MJ was used really well in this one, and I don't really like Liz as a love interest. I never really bought their chemistry, and I wasn't really emotionally invested either. I feel like she was there just to set up the big Vulture reveal twist. But other than that, I really enjoyed this film overall. Coming up next for me is Thor Ragnarok. I love so many things about this film. It's hilarious, emotional, and so much fun. My only complaint is that they lean too heavy towards the comedy during the dramatic moments and don't give things time to breathe. An example would be Thor's friends who we came to know and love, and they were just thrown away like trash, along with Thor's father dying. They just kind of move past it a little bit too quickly. The villain in this one is also really forgettable. She's cool but brings nothing new. But other than that, it's all positives for me. The comedy and action are both on fire in this one, leading into an ending that is epic and tragic, especially knowing what happens to the Asgardians next. I like how this movie found a good way to cripple Thor without taking his powers with the loss of his hammer. And continuing the character arc of overcoming loss is really well done here. The setting on the garbage planet was really interesting. I think Bruce Banner / the Hulk is at its very best here. They balance it, and the balance they find works great. And I love the dynamic between him and Thor. Loki joins the show as well and has one of the funniest lines when his brother gets Hulk smashed. There's so many great side characters in this one as well. Korg is amazing, as is Tessa Thompson as Valkyrie. Jeff Goldblum is having an absolute blast chewing the scenery here, and I love it. The soundtrack kicks some ass with the classic rock. This movie just has so much fun energy. I'm not sure how you can't have a good time watching it. Up next for me is the first Guardians of the Galaxy movie. The cast in this film is amazing and fun. They all bounce so well off each other. I especially love Drax and Rocket. I think they're both comedy gold, and I love how they set up character arcs that continue on in future movies, especially in Guardians 2 with Quill and Yondu's relationship. This movie has style and flair dripping all over it. By far one of the most unique and funny movies on this list. This movie has my favorite music out of all the MCU movies, and the world building they do here works perfectly without being too overwhelming. Ronan the Accuser is an okay villain, but we never really see him do anything. But it is always really interesting to see an Infinity Stone pop up in any of these movies, and we get a lot of it here. The action has a great energy, and I love the scene where the main cast meet for the first time and have that chase fight scene. I think if this one had more epic, memorable moments and emotion, it would be a little bit higher. But I think being where it is no knock at all on this list. Up next for me is Avengers Endgame, probably the most epic film on this list. The end battle in third act is so much fun and well done. Unfortunately though, the first act can be a little slow and is lacking the energy, but it sets up the events to come really well. This movie features so many small satisfying moments. Thor gaining weight and seeing his mom again, Cap in the elevator then fighting himself, Black Widow and Hawkeye's tragic quest, Spider-Man and Tony's reunion, Gamora and Star-Lord reunion, Cap finding a life as well as Tony's tragic death, and they somehow find a way to end and begin so many storylines, and it's just amazing. I also think they bring back Gamora, Thanos, and Loki really well. The reason it's not my number one is because even though the time travel is done well and fits great, it's a little clunky and not my favorite plotline, and the first half is a little moody and could use just a little bit more energy. And unfortunately, a lot of the characters we love are blipped until the very end. I'm also not a huge fan of Smart Hulk, and I think his intro at the diner is really cringy. I love this movie though, and I think it wraps things up amazingly, and has some of the most satisfying, badass moments in the whole MCU. Up next for me is Captain America Civil War. This movie is so epic, and for a while, this was my favorite MCU movie. The action in this movie is Marvel at its best. So many amazing, awesome, badass scenes. The movie starts with a bang and never lets up till the end, with a great battle at the airport leading up to the three-way fight between Cap, Bucky, and Tony that's flowing with emotion. The storyline balances the characters really well and even manages to perfectly introduce Spider-Man and Black Panther. And even though there's so many storylines, characters, and arcs, it's so understandable because it's set up so well through the other movies. And it even manages to make it so nobody feels left out and they all get their moments to shine. The themes and emotions put forward are all fantastic and relatable, especially the debate between Team Rogers and Team Stark. This is by far one of the more adult MCU movies, and I for sure appreciate it. My only big complaint is the villain Zemo. He is so weak, even though I get his motivation. The dominoes that would have to fall for his plan to work it's just absolutely ridiculous. Way too many plot holes. But other than that, I absolutely love this movie. In my number 2 spot is Guardians of the Galaxy 2. In my opinion, Guardians 2 has everything the first one had, but it doubles down. There's so much energy and style in this movie, and I don't know how you can't love it. It's probably the funniest movie on this list and the most emotional at the same time. The opening credit fight is absolutely amazing, and I love how it builds more onto Quill's backstory and makes it connect back to Yondu in a really emotional way, realizing he was his father the whole time. Kinda. I still cry at Yondu's funeral. I think they executed it superbly. I also really like Rocket's arc learning the importance of family. It's really relatable to everyone in my opinion. The story was really solid with Quill finding his father Ego, and I really like the stakes and motivations he brings. This movie sets up Nebula really well for Endgame, and I really grow to appreciate her as a character. And I also love the addition of Mantis. Her relationship with Drax is surprisingly sweet. And this movie features a lot more Drax as well. I love how naive and confident he is. Baby Groot is adorably amazing, and I think the final battle is also really good and balances everyone well. The music is great, though not as good as the first. I really don't have a lot of negatives for this one. I could see the humor being too much, but I think it balances out well, and the emotions are just flowing on this one. This movie makes me cry every time. In the first spot for me is Avengers Infinity War. This is the ultimate MCU movie in my opinion. There isn't really anything I don't love about it. It's among the most emotional, dynamic, and badass. It balances everyone perfectly with the different subplots. I don't think there's a single character that doesn't get a signature moment. The stakes are immediately high and there's an urgency throughout the whole film. I love the Guardians in this movie. They get to interact with a bunch of different MCU heroes and they mesh so well. The action is superb and still has me on the edge of my seat after 7 rewatches, along with crying at the end when the snap happens. It's paced perfectly and doesn't feel its runtime at all, and the humor blends with the epicness without undercutting it and taking anything away. The final battle has so many fun moments, from Thor showing up to Cap and Black Panther leading the charge. I love Peter and Tony's relationship here as well, building to the tragic death of both of them at one point. Thanos is amazing in this movie and he really gets some time to shine, and I think he's probably the best MCU villain. I'm not really sure what hasn't been said already. It's my number 1 for a reason. I think it's darn near perfect. Alright, that will do it. Make sure to like and subscribe if you don't want to miss out on more MCU content coming soon. And let me know what you think down below. I'd really like to have some engaging conversations about these movies. Thanks for watching, everyone. Have a good one.